So we wanted to talk about the ways that paintings can be trying to convince us of something that may or may not be true, and that we might have to think about who the image was created for, who paid for it, the artist's point of view, thinking about the image not as a fact.
This is such a good painting for this. This is Francisco Goya, the great Spanish Romantic painters, the 3rd of May, 1808, and he's responding to this intense political environment and this intense sort of this really tragic event. What had happened was Napoleon, who had been expanding his power throughout Europe, had been invited by actually the Spanish king to help him to help protect against an imminent English invasion, which, by the way, never came. Nevertheless, Napoleon is invited into Spain, moves his troops into Spain, and quickly replaces the Spanish king with his brother,
right,
with Napoleon's brother.
Right.
Now, what happens is the Spanish are not thrilled with this, and there's an uprising. And in fact, a sniper shoots one of the French soldiers. That's on May 2nd. The next day, the French round up a large group, really indiscriminately, a large group of Spanish peasants, line them up, and shoot them.
Right. No trial, no questioning. Doesn't matter if they're innocent or guilty. They just got round up and shot.
Now, Goya, of course, couldn't actually depict that immediately. He had to wait until the French were out of Spain. But by 1814, they were, and this painting was made.
Right. It would have been too politically sensitive to paint this in 1808 because it's an indictment of the Napoleonic army.
Goya might well have been shot.
So here we have the Napoleonic army, faceless, with their backs to us and their guns pointed at this innocent Spanish peasant. There's a whole line of figures here waiting to be shot, and then there's a pile of bodies in the front of figures who've already been shot. So there's this sense of time, and we know that this figure is next.
He's an incredible figure, too, incredibly sympathetic. We see his face and his human emotion, and he stares down his murderers. He's looking directly at them with an incredible kind of bravery. And look at his body. He's actually become a kind of Christ. He's become a martyr for Spain. And actually, if you look closely at the upper left of his body, at his hand, his right hand, you might be able to just make out the indentation of the stigmata. That is, as if he were Christ on the cross.
Right, and here's an image to compare it to of Christ.
Go back to the full image again, Beth. One of the things, I've looked at this a lot now, one of the things that's so interesting about the painting is how close everyone is to each other. In reality, the soldiers would never be so close to the victim, or the intended victim. The victim would be never so close to, everyone is pushed up against that hill or rock. It's kind of unclear what that is. The bodies are too close. There's hardly any room, which is maybe why the picture has become seems so powerful, that whole space is collapsed.
Yeah, this painting has a message that we sympathize with, which is that it's an image that depicts the horrors of war. On the other hand, it's important to remember that this is completely staged. This looked nothing like this, as you said. The space is compressed. The firing line would have been much more distant from the figures who were being shot. And so Goya's making, he's using the painting and the composition and light and dark to make a point. And so the innocent Spanish peasant is flooded with light. He has his arms up as though he's Christ.
But he's also completely entrapped. He's entrapped by all of the darkness that surrounds him, and whether that darkness is the backs of the Napoleonic soldiers, the threat of their guns, the darkness of the sky, or the shadows behind him. Right. He's completely enclosed, and there's no escape. So that there's a kind of intensity and a kind of emotional power that's really just quite extraordinary, riveting. And in fact, this becomes one of the paintings that people will refer back to when they want a way of historically looking at paintings that are emotionally powerful and about a kind of civil war, kind of violence.
I like to look at this close-up of his face because it's incredibly powerful. Goya's incredibly painterly. This white, you can see his brush strokes, and there's a sense of real sort of spontaneity to it, like he's almost captured this moment that's happening, and the figure looks as though he's pleading with his assassin. It's just awful.
It really is. It's extraordinary. He maintains his humanity beautifully, even under the most dire of circumstances.
Right. So here's an example of a painting that lies, but it has a message that we sympathize with, or it's constructed to make a point.
Let's look at a painting that is also about the Napoleonic army, but that's sort of creating the opposite, in a sense, that showed Napoleon's humanity, even in the face of one of the most terrible battles of the Napoleonic Wars.
Right. Napoleon said to him, the task was to create an image of him as this humane leader and not as someone who was aggressively conquering all of Europe. So he's shown here, and the idea is that Napoleon was supposed to have said at this moment, if all of the kings on earth could see this sight, obviously referring to all the carnage of the bodies in the foreground, the dead and the dying and the wounded, if all the kings on earth could see this sight, they would be less greedy for war and conquests, which is so ironic because he's the one who waged this war, and yet the painter is being asked to convey an image of Napoleon as the very opposite.
As this merciful figure.
Right.
And in fact, even one of the people that he's just conquered comes to him, and he's sympathetic.
Right. And asked to serve Napoleon.
That's right. And so I guess the idea is that not just paintings, of course, but photographs as well, images of all sorts, can really sort of produce a kind of perspective, a kind of point of view. And I think that if we look at these kinds of issues in modern terms, we'll see some interesting kinds of parallels.
The image on the left was actually an image that was only released due to a Freedom of Information Act filed by Ralph Begleiter, who is a professor of journalism at the University of Delaware.
Now, what is that?
Well, what this is actually the coffins of soldiers who have been killed in Iraq. And the American public certainly does not get to see images of the dead and or dying because they've basically been censored by the military and they're been made unavailable to the public. This was a lesson that the Pentagon learned after the Vietnam War, when those images that the public saw every night on TV was certainly one of the artifacts that galvanized a protest against the war. And
so let me ask you a question. If the image on the left is being actually produced by the U.S. government but then held back, the image on the right is a kind of image that is actually being sort of put out there in its stead.
One definitely selectively releases what one wants to project.
Right.
And in this case...
Yeah, here he is looking like the hero, like Napoleon.
So he's actually in the gear of battle.
I like how his head only his head rises above the horizon line.
It's actually very well composed.
It really
image.
is. And on the left, if you think about it in terms of when we were thinking about Goya and that diagonal line of figures that moved back into space, I think one of the things that makes this photograph so powerful is this seemingly endless line of coffins that go back into space. So we brought in a couple of more images of leaders who are trying to portray themselves in a particular light.
The image on the right, Napoleon crossing the Alps, part of his famous campaign as he would begin to conquer Italy. And he's here shown himself in this extraordinarily sort of energetic image rising up the Alps. This is completely fabricated, isn't it?
Totally fabricated.
Because in fact the real story is that Napoleon had actually crossed the Alps not on a horse.
On a mule.
On a mule.
Right.
That wouldn't have the same effect, would it?
No, not on a mule. It would have looked very sad. But Napoleon instructed David, who painted this image, very specifically to depict him in a certain way, and that was, as Napoleon said, calm on a fiery steed.
I'm interested in the graffiti that's been carved into the rocks.
But before we do that, let's talk about the calm on the fiery steed.
Okay.
Because I think that's important, because it makes him look completely in power and in charge, in control of everything, of this passionate wild animal.
Of nature itself.
Right.
As if he was almost a god.
As crossing the Alps and in charge of everything.
I want to get back to the graffiti that's carved into the stone. You can see the freshest cuts say Napoleon, or say rather Bonaparte. But he's crossing the Alps as had previous rulers that he's modeling himself on, and they include Carolus Magnus, that is to say Charlemagne, or Charles the Great from the medieval period, and even very vaguely Hannibal, who had entered Italy in the ancient world. And so Napoleon clearly is trying to sort of enter into that historical continuum. Do you think that Bush is doing that in any way as well, in the image on the left?
Absolutely.
It seems to be iconographic. We have some, I can't quite make the association, but it looks like a familiar image.
I guess what I was thinking about was, here he is on an aircraft carrier, right? with this expression of victory. And, of course, the Second World War was definitively ended on an aircraft carrier as well when the Japanese surrendered to the West. And so I can't help but think that there's a kind of reprise or a kind of reflection of that earlier and sort of really critical moment
of victory. What's funny to me is Bush holding up his right thumb and Napoleon
and holding up his index finger,
pointing up the Alps. Forward, men.
As opposed to okay.
Yeah, there's no hesitation about it. We're gung ho. We did it. Everything's fine. We don't need to think about things. We don't need to reflect on terrible carnage.
So both of these images are really meant to construct the way we're to look at these events and the way we're meant to see these leaders.
Right. And, of course, things are being left out, right? When the camera looks at something, other things are outside the frame of the camera that the photograph isn't capturing.
So what other kinds of images have we sort of defined this?
Well, we brought along Picasso's Guernica, just as another example, like Goya, of a painting that is famous as another anti-war image, another image about the pain and the horror of war.
And actually related to the Goya, two great Spanish painters looking at two terrible moments in Spanish history when a tremendous number of innocent civilians are being killed.
During the Spanish Civil War.
That's right, during the Spanish Civil War under Franco, and as opposed to, again, by the French. And I think it's clear that Picasso looked back to the Goya as a source. I mean, just look at the sharp contrast between light and shadow, between light and dark.
Or look at this figure in the foreground, who's stretched out here, much the way that Goya's victims were in the foreground.
And both of them, in a sense, although they're about very specific events, the 3rd of May, 1808, or the bombing of the city of Guernica, they're both also very much about the universal pain and destruction of war.
Right.
Which is why, if we can go to the other slide at the UN, which is why this painting was such a threat when Powell made his presentation at the UN to justify the American invasion.
It's just so ironic because this is a reproduction of the painting that the UN obviously intentionally put up to remind everybody about the horrors of war and the importance of diplomacy, right, at the United Nations. But Powell goes in and essentially, as we know now, lies, although he may or may not have known that, about Iraq's having weapons of mass destruction, right.
And then actually orders that this tapestry, this copy of Guernica, this great anti-war testament, is actually covered up so that he's not giving his press conference in front of it,
right.
in front of women and children being burned to death.
Right, because he's calling for war on Iraq.
And we know that images, the power of images, let's look at the Abu Ghraib's photos. The biggest complaint that came out of the Pentagon was, why were those damn images released?
Exactly. The focus was all on the pictures.
The focus was on the images and on the power of the images.
Right. Not about what we did, but those damn pictures that came out.
And this is incredibly powerful. These images are unflinching, although I don't think that was the intent of the photographer, clearly. But the Goya that we have up next to it is to make us sympathetic, which is a very different kind of initial intent. So if we look at the Goya for just a moment, we're seeing another Napoleonic Guard who looks at this hanged body.
We should say that this is from an entire series that Goya did.
The Disasters of
War.
Right. And what I find so disturbing about this is the look of satisfaction and almost pleasure on the face of the soldier as he looks up at this hanged man.
That's funny. I never interpreted it that way. I always interpreted it as sort of callous disregard.
Yeah.
As though, when we're looking at a dead rat in the street and not necessarily a human being, as though it just didn't matter. People had died, and also died these incredibly awful deaths. Not only hung, but this figure with his pants coming down to his ankles. It's just so humiliating.
Unfortunately, we actually don't have any reproductions for this little presentation, but I don't know whether you've seen those pictures of lynchings. There have been a couple of exhibitions in the last few years here in New York. And it's much the same look. You have crowds of people kind of milling around, actually picnicking.
That's right.
That's right.
Picnicking around.
There were social events
around lynched people.
Right. And, I mean, it reminds me also of images of the Holocaust, just people standing around and looking at this incredible violence.
The normalcy
right.
of violence.
Exactly. And that's there in the Abu Ghraib image as well. Yeah. And for the photographer, even, who's just standing there.
I mean, we've been talking about the way that an image can be constructed to mean something. But as in Abu Ghraib, sometimes the meaning of the image can get away from its author.
Absolutely.
And can mean something very powerful in and of itself.
So what does this image mean, do you think, to the American public? What have these Abu Ghraib images meant? It feels to me like we saw all of these horrid images, but nothing really
I think
happened.
it means shame. And I think that's one of the reasons that it's fallen out of the discourse as quickly as possible.
We're ashamed of what we did.
I think that's right.
I hope we are.